choose the best, or indeed to choose to create anything at all. It must be metaphysically possible for God to choose not to create, or to choose to create less than the best, since there are alternative courses of action open to him, which are possible. Namely, those are the worlds that do not imply contradiction. And the third core claim of the moral necessity doctrine in the Theodicy says, because it's not metaphysically necessitated, God's choice of the best is free. And you also find a fourth claim in the Theodicy as well, which just says God acts out of moral necessity, but this doesn't derogate from his freedom. But I think that's just simply a very condensed summary of the above 3 points. So anyway, these are the points that Leibniz makes again and again in the Theodicy when he discusses moral necessity in the context of God's choice of the best. And they're also the same points that Leibniz makes in other late writings, like his correspondence with Samuel Clarke. And I think on that basis alone, it would be correct to say that for Leibniz, these are the core features of the doctrine of moral necessity, at least as it concerns the issue of God's choice and the theological necessitation argument. And other moral necessitarians may have identified other features as being core, or more features as being core. But those, I think, are the ones that Leibniz takes to be the central ones to the doctrine of moral necessity. And what's interesting, and this is what we can see hopefully in the right-hand column there, is that we can also find Leibniz making exactly the same points in much earlier writings, certainly from the 1680s onwards, and in some cases even earlier than that. But as the bottom row shows, in the Theodicy, he sometimes wraps up these points in the language of the moral necessitarians. But in the earlier writings, he doesn't do that. So on this basis, it's tempting to conclude that Leibniz accepted all the key tenets of moral necessitarianism from around the 1680s or so. But he just didn't employ the associated terminology until 1707 or thereabouts. And if that's correct, it looks as though the only change or the only development is that in the later texts, Leibniz uses the language of moral necessity, whereas in the earlier ones, the discussion is just not couched in those terms. Now, if there's something to this interpretation, then perhaps we ought not to be asking why Leibniz decided to align himself with the moral necessitarians from 1707 onwards. Because, in fact, he had aligned himself with them much earlier, from around the 1680s or so. But he just didn't avail himself of the terminology at that time. So our question would become something like this. Why did Leibniz decide to appropriate the language of the moral necessitarians from 1707 onwards? And I guess one possible answer could be something like this. In his maturity, one of Leibniz's key aims was the dissemination of his thought, particularly, of course, through more popular channels. And the Theodicy, I guess, is certainly one of those. Now, adopting a term that has solid philosophical pedigree, and which was apparently in common currency at the time, would no doubt have contributed to this aim. Now, I have no doubts at all that this hypothesis has its problems, and that various rival hypotheses could be constructed as well. Anyway, I think the position that Mike presented is different from the one that's just been sketched. I think Mike's position is that in his later thought, Leibniz introduces a new doctrine, or a new notion, into his philosophy, which is that of moral necessity. And another aspect of Mike's position is that when Leibniz adopts this new doctrine, or this new notion, he starts to background his earlier responses to the theological necessity argument in favour of the new doctrine of moral necessity. And I'd be very interested to hear more about this, especially in light of the alternative position, which I think is there, which suggests that what Leibniz introduces into his later thought is just new terminology to refer to a set of claims or doctrines that had in fact been part of this philosophy for at least 2 decades beforehand. So on that note, I'd like to turn the discussion back over to Mike.
want to thank Lloyd for the comments and for the grid that was very helpful in looking back over earlier texts and looking for points of contact between claims endorsed in Theodicy with respect to this thesis and the same claims in earlier texts. And I actually I don't have anything more to say about it. I actually agree that this view is present in the earlier texts. And I didn't mean to imply that at some point in the around I think the earliest reference I found is 1705, but that something magical happened at that point in time, and Leibniz adopted this new position. I think he did just adopt new terminology, and maybe he stumbled across this and thought, well, this is the sort of view I've been defending all along. I'll just hitch my wagon to this crew. But there are actually reasons to doubt that, and I wish I knew more than I know. That's just generally true. But in this case, there's a lot going on with respect to disputes about moral necessity at this juncture because of certain alliances that were formed between certain Jansenists and certain moral necessitarians. And I just don't know enough of the historical story. I commend the project to someone to go figure out what the story is. But it looks to me like this was an inopportune moment for Leibniz to hitch his wagon to this position. So I don't have an explanation as to why he did it, but there it is. So I agree. The view is the same. The terminology is different. Why he's allying himself with this group, I don't know. I mean, some of you know that Leibniz is in correspondence with people around this time where he is claiming to have read some of the major figures in this tradition. It's not necessarily credible that he did read them. I mean, there were even chunks of material that were sent to him that by moral necessitarians, or pieces by others who are referring to these works, and it's not clear that he read them carefully, or I don't know, maybe Don can tell us more about that. But yeah, it's a puzzle, and I have no solutions.
If you have a question now, you can make your way to the microphone.
Thanks to both Mike and Lloyd for really excellent paper and commentary. Mike, first, I think I stand by my interpretation of both the meaning and the significance of the 17:6 passage, but that's not what I want discussion of now. Okay. You gave, I think, a more extensive and more compelling account of the views of Ruiz and Montoya than I had seen before, and I'm very grateful for that. Two questions. First question is this. If I took in your account of them, it seems to me that their view is, in an important sense, completely deterministic, as completely and infallibly deterministic, as much so as Leibniz's views. But the important point is that the determination involved is, at least in part, by final causation rather than any other sort of causation. And I think that's certainly a part of Leibniz's determinism also. First question is, am I wrong about that? Second question is this. So interpreted, it doesn't seem to me that the view really works effectively to shield God from moral responsibility for what happens in the world. Am I missing something there?
Well, with respect to the first question, I guess what you're asking is, do you think the view does what they intended to do? I mean, when you're claiming that it looks like it's objectionably deterministic, or well, yeah, okay. I mean. I mean, how can I say no? I mean, because in one sense, everyone's admitting that there is a necessity at work here. So, sure, it's determined in the sense that it's necessary